As our ushers return to the back of the church, it is my privilege to welcome to our church once again Sean Mitchell, who is the Director of Stewardship at Myers Park Presbyterian Church in Charlotte, but also who was our capital campaign consultant almost 10 years ago in 2007 during our Lift High the Cross capital campaign, for which all of the renovation and construction that occurred here was raised and developed and paid for. Sean, we welcome you to hear briefly your words about stewardship as we begin that season in the life of this church.
Good morning. It's good to be here with you this morning. I want to start by just sharing a story with you out of a very familiar spiritual memoir called Traveling Mercies. The author's name is Anne Lamott. Many of you may have read this book. It came out more than 10 years ago. But in this memoir, Lamott shares her conversion story, among other things. She shares how at a moment in her life when she was struggling with addiction, had frequent hangovers, how when she would wake up in the morning, she would often wander down to the flea market that was downtown in the city in which she lived. And on the days when she would go to the flea market, that happened to be Sundays, she would hear this singing coming from across the street. She realized it was a church. And so every Sunday morning, when she just happened to be going to the flea market in her hangover state, and she heard the singing, as the story goes, she would move closer and closer to the church building every single Sunday, until eventually on one Sunday, she actually stood at the front door and listened to the music and listened to the service. Finally, one Sunday, Lamott enters the sanctuary and does what all of you are doing. She sits, but she listens, she observes, until finally one Sunday when she just happens to go back to the flea market, she enters the sanctuary, she sits like all of you are doing, and she finally joins in on the singing. The rest is history for Anne Lamott. She shares how that experience of going to the flea market on those Sundays and eventually ending up in the sanctuary and eventually becoming a part of that church community, that was how she met God's unconditional love. You are in a season that's called your stewardship campaign season. You all should have received your pledge packets this Sunday, and inside of those packets you've got a pledge card, and you've got a letter, and you've got a theme, and the point of it is to inspire you to write down information on the pledge card. The point of it is to inspire you to be generous. But I want to share with you something else about what's going on about the next 4 weeks that's actually a powerful undercurrent. It's an invitation to practice a very core spiritual discipline. That discipline is the discipline of remembrance. Over and over again throughout the biblical narrative, God tells His people to remember. For example, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. How often did we hear God say, "Remember my commands"? And then in the New Testament, we hear Jesus telling His followers, His disciples, "Remember what I told you?" And then the psalmist, in a very familiar passage, in a state of depression, prays, my soul, why are you so downcast? Remember God." So the undercurrent over the course of the next 4 weeks, the invitation is for you to do the same thing, to practice remembrance. And here's what I invite you to remember as you hold the pledge card in your hand, as you pray, as you discern, God, what are you calling me to give? What are you calling me to share with this family? Here's what I want you to remember. Number one, I want you to remember Anne Lamott's story. If the church had not been meeting and singing and listening to the teachings of Jesus and giving and gathering like they were, Anne Lamott's story would be very different. her life would be very different today. So I want you to remember Anne Lamont's story. And that story informs us that it's important to be present, to just keep showing up and being in the church over and over and over again, and to trust that activity to God and His care. Second thing I want you to remember is your story. You are the church. 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 This building is not the church. You are. You are it. There is nobody else. God called you here to be a part of what He is doing through this family in Belmont and across the world. That is a special identity, and it is something to take very seriously and very joyfully. I want you to remember that. That is who you are above anything else and more than anything else. You are the church. Keep showing up. Keep caring for one another. Keep loving your neighbors. Keep making disciples. Do it again and again and again. That's the undercurrent. Remember that. And lastly, I want you to remember whose you are. I want you to remember who called you to be here. You belong to Jesus. Sam is a friend of mine. I think Sam is an incredible pastor. But Sam is not the head of this church. Jesus the Christ, the one who has been raised from the dead and ascended to the right hand of God. Jesus is your head. Jesus is your shepherd. He is your guide. Keep showing up. Keep following Him. Keep entrusting your giving to His care. That is why it doesn't matter how much you have to give, but why it does matter that you give. Whether you have $1 to share or $10,000, do it. Because when you're doing it, you're sharing it with the head of the church, who is going to receive all of your gifts. He will break them and He will multiply them. And keep on loving and redeeming and restoring our world. Don't forget to do those things. Don't forget to practice remembrance.